Okay, welcome back. This is Dr. Charla Ogaz with Heart, Mind, Soul Studios. And today we're continuing our series, Why Study Feminism. And this is part 2. And we are discussing domestic violence today. So, Why Study Feminism Part 2, we're calling this When Love Hurts. And I'm going to approach domestic violence prevention from various angles. First, I'm going to start with how I came to this work as a feminist and how actually the work defined me and my feminism. And then I'm going to do a more national, macro, very quick run through of some important things that happened to advance this movement and its awareness campaigns. And then I'm going to come back to the local and discuss what's happening here where I am, and then present some data to you to convince you that this is one of the most valuable movements in feminism. And it is an international movement, even though I'll be focusing on what's more local and what I know, which is the context of the United States. So let me go ahead and start by explaining how I come to this work. I was an undergraduate at Colorado College in 1989 when I attended a winter break conference. It was a week-long conference on campus that was on the topic of love. And I attended a lecture. I'm sorry to say I don't remember the lecture or who gave it. But I was a sophomore in college, and after the presentation, I stood up to ask a question. And I asked, what happens in the context of love hurting? Why does love hurt sometimes? Why can love and pain be so closely embedded, intertwined? And I don't even remember what the speaker gave me as his answer. But what I do remember is that I was carrying pain in my heart as I had been then currently estranged from my mother. And I had grown up in a home that did include domestic violence, as much as it included a lot of love and joy. And I needed to understand what it meant. Why could love be so painful? After I asked my question and the talk ended and dispersed, I was approached by 2 women, and one of them became a mentor of mine, and she recruited me into an internship, a paid internship, at what was then called the Center for Prevention of Domestic Violence in downtown Colorado Springs. She brought with her, the other woman was her intern, who was another college student who was leaving the position. And so they had come to attend the conference, and she was scouting for her next possible intern. So when she heard me ask this question, she knew that I understood something more deep than just love on the surface, but that love could, in fact, bring pain. And so that's how I came to this work as a feminist. And in fact, my work there was, in fact, informed how I took on the identity of becoming a feminist. And so from there, I'd like to discuss a short history, present to you a short history of the domestic violence prevention campaigns movement in the feminist movement, sometimes called the Battered Women's Justice Movement. It has other names as well. But generally, the feminist rallies around the idea that women were being beaten started in 1970 and continued for a couple decades. And so I'm going to highlight some of the things that feminists have done in the movement against domestic violence, interpersonal violence. So feminist rallies started in 1970 and continued through, they're still continuing, honestly, but the decade was full of them. It was grassroots. It was used a feminist social change approach to raise awareness of violence against women. This short history that I'm going to give you is from the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and you can find it at nnedv.org. Okay? So in October 1976, there was a Wisconsin conference on battered women. And this was the first national conference that established a national newsletter called the National Communication Network for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. In 1977, we had the first Take Back the Night, and Take Back the Night is a lovely annual campaign protest that women, often on college campuses, participate in. It's a nighttime protest march to take back the night because so much violence against women happens in the night, and so many women are terrified of the night and do not leave their homes at night because of the threat of violence against them. So Take Back the Night started in 1977. Also in 1977, one of the first organizations to address domestic violence prevention started. It was called the Marin, in Marin, California, Abused Women's Services, MAWS, and then it was later changed to the Center for Domestic Peace. It continues to lead in the field of domestic violence prevention centers. In 1977, we also had the first program to address the offenders or perpetrators of domestic violence, and that was called Emerge, and it emerged in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was the first abuser education program in the nation with a mission to eliminate violence in intimate relationships. In 1977, a hot year, it was the first International Women's Year Conference also happened, and women there worked together to form coalitions to create a national battered women's movement. 1978, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence was started, and that was again feminist organizing to create the organization. There was also a magazine, Aegis, the magazine on ending violence against women, which was started in 1978. At the national level, in July 1979, the Surgeon General's report on health promotion and disease prevention, called Healthy People, identified stress and violent behavior among the 15 key priority areas for public health. In 1979, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And in 1980, teen dating violence curriculum started, based on the work of a woman who was doing education on rape and sexual assault and battering as crimes against women in high schools in California. And in her discussion with the students, she realized that teenage girls and women were also already suffering crimes against them by their teenage boyfriends. So she started the curriculum based on that. In 1980, the Family Violence Prevention Fund was started, and this was a national leader in domestic violence prevention work to prevent and end violence against women and children around the world. So it became a global effort from the United States at that point. In 1980, we also had the appearance of the New York City Anti-Violence Project, and this was one of the first times that anti-violence projects started to address hate violence, sexual violence, and intimate partner violence together, and in particular in LGBTQAI+ communities, also HIV-affected communities. They provided counseling, advocacy, organizing, and public education, which is often the model of every organization doing this work. In October of 1981, Domestic Violence Awareness Week was started and celebrated, and then a National Day of Unity happened on October 17th, 1981. This was organized by the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and it declared a National Day of Unity on behalf of all battered women across the world and the country, obviously. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence also held the first National Women of Color Conference in 1982 to address race, class, and homophobia as central themes of this issue. We also had in 1983 the publication of the first articulation of what we now call intersectionality, and this was by Audre Lorde, whose main concept was that there is no hierarchy of oppressions, but we must identify issues of class, race, age, gender, and even health as being fundamental to the female experience. It says here that the concept, quote, the concept of intersectionality has been critical to our understanding of the complex experiences of survivors of trauma and how violence and oppression, sexism, racism, classism, heterosexism, and ableism are intrinsically linked. And we'll explore intersectionality in another video. In 1984, the staff of the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project created the original Power and Control Wheel, which we'll show later in the slides. It is a 8.5 by 11 piece of information that has been translated into over 40 languages, and it's resonated with the experience of battered women worldwide. If you show up at a center that hopes to prevent domestic violence, you will show up or leave at least with the Power and Control Wheel, and we'll look over that later. In 1984, The Burning Bed was made, and it featured Farrah Fawcett as the main star, and it provided visibility to the issue of domestic violence. And it ignited discussions about the experiences of battered women as well. The Color Purple came out in 1985. It was directed by Steven Spielberg and based on a novel by Alice Walker. And it showed a protagonist character, the main character, who was a victim of child sexual abuse, incest, forced marriage, and domestic violence. And in the end, Sally's character became a triumphant symbol, quote, a quite triumphant symbol of freedom and resilience for survivors. The only other thing I would like to draw attention to on this excellent history is that by 1987, we had the first dating violence prevention programs as well. And Los Angeles Commission on Assaults Against Women and the Marin Abused Women's Services Organization led the way to create some of the first in the country dating violence prevention programs and materials. Okay, so that shows how feminist activism has worked for decades to bring attention to the fact that women are still second-class citizens, in particular in their homes. Not always, but often. And now we're going to turn back to the slides and discuss a little bit more about the local context in which the examples can be illustrated. So what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is defined as, quote, a pattern of coercive behaviors used by a competent adult or adolescent to establish and maintain power and control over another competent adult or adolescent. These behaviors can occur sporadically or continually. Each incident builds upon previous episodes, setting the stage for future violence. Domestic violence includes physical violence, psychological violence, sexual abuse, and stalking. So how prevalent is domestic violence? So when I was being trained as a confidential victim advocate here in Colorado Springs at TESA, in 2019, in Colorado Springs, the police report responding to approximately 30 to 40 calls every day on domestic violence. And research suggests that only 25 to 35% of incidents are actually reported. Domestic violence is significantly tied to homelessness. In 2019, a Colorado Springs homeless shelter surveyed 2,949 people who they served, and they were asked if homelessness is a direct result of DV. 586 reported yes, and 50 others refused to answer, suggesting that perhaps there was a secret there as well. How is DV connected to homelessness? 90% of victims of DV report financial abuse. Of families experiencing DV, 38% become homeless when they leave their abusers. Homeless families have higher rates of family violence than do any other subpopulation of homeless people. 60% of homeless women report that DV is the cause of their homelessness. 90% said that DV is in their background. 15% of cities surveyed by the U.S. Conference of Mayors identified DV as their primary reason for homelessness. And research estimates that the Violence Against Women Act of 1994 saved nearly $14.8 billion in net averted social costs in its first 6 years. This information is from 2015, an article by Susan M. Long. What about the prevalence of sexual assault? In 2019, Colorado Springs' sexual assault rate was double the national average. Research has not been completed, to my knowledge, to explain why that is. But research estimates only 30% of incidents are reported again. Many people ask why she stays, and if she stays, then she must deserve it, right? So why doesn't she leave? 5 clues to the complex of emotions that a victim may be having during the abuse cycles is love, hope, learned helplessness, dependence, and fear. Those could all be explored deeply, but we're not going to do that right now. On the topic of children and intimate partner violence, 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence each year, and 90% of these children are eyewitnesses to this violence. Technically, that is considered emotional abuse for a child to be exposed, even to the hearing through closed doors of violence between adults. 63% of all boys aged 11 to 20 who commit murder kill the man who was abusing their mother. This is very devastating information, right? So at TESA, where I was a clinical volunteer, and then I was trained in confidential victim advocacy, and then I also did pre-plea investigative reports for the courts in El Paso County. TESA, that organization of Colorado Springs, served, at least in 2019, 15,000 people. Their services, like a typical DV shelter nonprofit, include a safe house, shelter, a phone hotline, victim advocacy, including in-hospital emergency rooms and the courthouse, children's programs, victim counseling, legal services, and outreach. So you can see that over the decades, since attention has been drawn to this issue, so the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, 2024, so 55 years. This infrastructure has arisen through feminist activism in order to catch these victims before they fall completely through, right? Completely through the social structures. Here is the power and control wheel, which I told you about. It was formed in Duluth based on work with abuse victims and their abusers. And I won't read the entire thing to you. You can find this online. It's very important pamphlet, so to speak, to distribute It can coalesce for a woman who, again, believes that her personal experience is just happening to her. It can help her see that, no, this is a dynamic that unfortunately includes many people, and that you're not alone, and that your personal problems are, in fact, political problems. Okay. So we have just here on the outside very quickly using coercion and threats, using intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, using male privilege, and using economic abuse. Unfortunately, this is not love. This is power and control. A victim may feel love in return, but that's something different as well. There can be love in there, but there are other things going on. Another 8.5 by 11 piece of information that can really help clarify to someone who's being victimized what's going on is illustration of the cycle of abuse. And so here we see the tension building in the relationship. So the batterer is getting more and more angry, and the tension is building in the relationship. And then inevitably there is an acute explosion, which again can include all kinds of different things. Sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's sexual specifically, and sometimes it's emotional or financial abuse. After the acute explosion, the couple will go through a honeymoon phase, we call it, where the batterer, they repent and bring flowers and make promises and are certain that this will never happen again, and they convince the victim that that is in fact true. So you can see the different characteristics of the batterer on the inside of the circle, and then on the outside of the circle you can see the victim's responses as examples. And then I'm going to quickly go through these other documents. To me, these are historical documents. These documents show that in 2024, there are people still hiding, looking for safety, making plans, living in fight, flight, or freeze, living in a victim status. This is a safety sheet, a safety planning sheet for pets of domestic violence victims. Yes, even pets must be thought about in attempting to plan to leave an abusive relationship. This is safety tips for victims of domestic violence. Again, you can see the detail that a victim has to go through. Planning with the kids, hiding money and keys, informing your employer, documenting the abuse, gathering documents for safekeeping and in case you leave, considering a protection order, right? This is another worksheet that a domestic violence victim can fill out to affirm their personalized safety plan. This is a safety plan for stalking, and stalking is a crime. In particular, evidence starts when the victim says no. So if you are a victim of stalking, it's important for you to say no in text, in some sort of recorded document, to illustrate that you said no and the behavior did not stop. And that's when, as I understand it, the behavior becomes criminal. There are the safety tips again. Here's a safety plan for teens. Okay, and so that completes the slide portion of this presentation. So why study feminism? Sometimes love hurts, and unfortunately, if that's something that you've experienced as an adult, you've probably experienced it as a child. The programming starts early for this type of love, right? And so I hope that today I've illustrated to you not just that the problem exists, right? The problem of interpersonal violence, But there are many, many feminists, men and women, who are working every day. This is where feminism, the rubber of feminism, hits the road, right? Meets the road. Every day, feminist-minded people go to work for very low salaries to do the work to save those of us who are most vulnerable and those of us who are most psychologically entrapped in the violence of patriarchy, right? The violence of patriarchy that invades homes, invades minds, invades bodies, and brings some of us to our knees in an absolute, utter attempt to survive. So, thank you for watching today. I appreciate your attention, and happy International Women's Day. See you next time.